The genius who built the dark web's largest hacking empire. Somewhere beneath the ordinary surface of the internet, beneath the e-commerce sites, the social media platforms, the search engines and the streaming services, there exists another world. It has no physical address. It has no storefront. It cannot be found through Google. To reach it, you need special software, encrypted connections, and the willingness to descend into a space where normal laws feel suspended, where anonymity is currency, and where the line between technical genius and criminal enterprise is as thin as a single forgotten email address. This is the story of that world, and of the extraordinary troubled individual who, for a brief period in the second decade of the 21st century, built the largest criminal marketplace in the history of the internet. And it is a story that intersects with questions of privacy, freedom, power, and the enduring human capacity for both brilliant innovation and catastrophic self-destruction. It is also, ultimately, a story about the limits of anonymity and about how even the most sophisticated architects of the digital underground can be undone by the smallest, most human of errors. Before we go further, let us be clear about one thing. The events described in this narrative are real. The timelines are documented. The facts are verified. The scale of what was built and of what was lost is not fiction. What follows is investigative journalism drawn from court records, law enforcement disclosures, academic research, and documented public sources. The names of the individuals involved are well known to the historical record. But in keeping with the spirit of this narrative, we will refer to our central figure not by his real name, but as the architect, the man who designed and built the dark web's most powerful empire. If you're finding this story compelling, we invite you to subscribe to this channel and activate the notification bell so you never miss an investigation like this one. Every week, we bring you documented, rigorously researched stories from the frontiers of digital crime, geopolitics, and the hidden forces shaping our world. Subscribe now. The truth is always worth knowing.
At the door. Wait for the signal.
Part 1. The Architecture of Shadows, a world before the architect. To understand how someone builds the largest illegal marketplace in internet history, you must first understand the world in which it was built. That world did not emerge overnight. It grew slowly, organically, over more than a decade of technological development, ideological ferment, and law enforcement failure. The internet, in its earliest publicly accessible form, was already being used for illicit trade by the late 1990s. But the early underground was crude, fragile, and easily surveilled. Forums for trading stolen credit card numbers and counterfeit documents operated openly on surface web servers, with only rudimentary attempts at hiding identity. Law enforcement in the United States and Europe began to track these communities, and the arrests came relatively easily. The criminals of the early internet age were, by modern standards, almost naively exposed. Two technologies would change this equation entirely. The first was Tor, the onion router, a system originally developed in the mid-1990s by researchers at the United States Naval Research Laboratory and later released to the public in 2002 through the nonprofit Tor project. Tor works by routing internet traffic through a series of volunteer-operated servers around the world, encrypting it multiple times at each step so that any individual node in the network knows only the previous and the next hop in the chain, never the full picture. The result is a degree of anonymity that, in theory, makes it nearly impossible to trace internet activity back to its source. The second technology was Bitcoin, Introduced in 2009 by an anonymous developer or group of developers using the pseudonym Satoshi Nakamoto, Bitcoin offered something that no previous payment system had managed: a way to transfer value across the internet without using banks, without using government-regulated financial infrastructure, and without creating a record that could be easily tied to a real-world identity. Transactions were recorded on a public ledger, the blockchain, but the wallet addresses involved were pseudonymous. In the right hands, with the right precautions, Bitcoin could be used to pay for things without leaving a financial trail that authorities could follow. Put these two technologies together, Tor for anonymous browsing and Bitcoin for anonymous payments, and you had, for the first time in history, the technical infrastructure for a truly anonymous marketplace. The question was not whether someone would build one. When the question was who would do it first and how large they would build it. The answer came in early 2011 from an unlikely direction. A young American with a background in physics and a passionate commitment to libertarian political philosophy launched a website that he described as an online market free from government interference. He called it Silk Road. He called himself the Dread Pirate Roberts, borrowing a name from a beloved fantasy novel. And almost immediately, Silk Road became the most talked about website on the internet, at least among those who knew where to look. Silk Road was, by the standards of what would come later, relatively small, but it was a proof of concept of staggering importance. By the time the FBI shut it down in October 2013, the website had processed approximately 9.5 million Bitcoin in transactions, a sum that, at exchange rates of the time, equated to roughly 1.2 billion US dollars. It had nearly 1 million registered users. It had thousands of vendors. And it had demonstrated, beyond any doubt, that the dark web marketplace model could work. That with Tor and Bitcoin and a degree of operational care, a person could run a billion-dollar criminal enterprise from a laptop and remain invisible to law enforcement for years. The FBI's arrest of Silk Road's founder was a watershed moment, but it was not the end of the dark web. It was the beginning of something much larger. Within weeks of Silk Road's closure, new marketplaces appeared. Silk Road 2.0 launched within a month, run by former administrators of the original site. Other competitors emerged. Black Market Reloaded, Agora, Evolution. Each learned from the mistakes of its predecessors. Each tried to build more securely, more carefully, with better operational security. And in December 2014, from an anonymous server in Lithuania, a new marketplace went online that would dwarf everything that had come before. Its name was Alphabay, and its creator was about to change the dark web forever. Part 2. The making of the architect. The man who would build Alphabay was born in 1991 in a mid-sized city in Quebec, Canada. From an early age, he displayed the kind of facility with computers and technology that, in another life, might have led to a distinguished career in cybersecurity or software development. His father later told investigators that his son had demonstrated an unusually high IQ from childhood, reportedly around 140, and that he had displayed remarkable aptitude for mathematics, programming, and problem-solving. By the time he was a teenager, the architect was already moving in the online spaces that would define his later life. Around 2008, when he would have been approximately 17 years old, a pseudonymous user calling himself Alpha02 began appearing on carding forums, the online communities where hackers and fraudsters traded in stolen financial information. This was not yet the work of a criminal mastermind. It was the apprenticeship of a technically gifted young person who had found, in the underground forums of the early internet, a community that valued the skills he was developing. Alpha 02 was not merely a consumer in these spaces. He was a contributor. He posted technical advice. He sold digital products. He built a reputation as someone who understood the technical architecture of online fraud in ways that went beyond the average forum participant. His writing was precise, analytical, and confident. His approach was methodical. Even in those early years, before he had built anything that would attract international law enforcement attention, the qualities that would define his later work were already visible. Technical sophistication, an entrepreneurial instinct, and an almost obsessive attention to the mechanics of how things worked. In his legitimate life, the architect was running a small computer repair business in Canada. He maintained a LinkedIn profile. He had a public professional presence. And he had a Hotmail address, an ordinary personal email account registered under his real name that he used for both his legitimate business and, fatally, for communications related to his underground activities. This detail, the Hotmail address, will become enormously important later. For now, it stands as evidence of something that investigators and cybersecurity experts would later emphasize repeatedly. Even the most technically sophisticated criminals make basic operational security mistakes. The architect knew more about encryption and anonymization technology than almost anyone alive. But he also had the habit, common to many people who operate at the intersection of legal and illegal activity, of using the same digital infrastructure for both. The line between Alpha 02, the dark web entrepreneur, and the real person behind the screen was thinner than it should have been. By the early 2000s, the architect had been watching the development of Silk Road with intense interest. He saw what was being built, understood its significance, and began to think about how it could be improved. Silk Road, for all its groundbreaking achievement, had weaknesses. It accepted only Bitcoin, despite Bitcoin's imperfect anonymity. Its technical architecture was not as robust as it could be. Its vendor and buyer verification systems were rudimentary. Its dispute resolution processes were informal and inconsistently applied. The architect, with his engineer's mind, saw a poorly designed machine where others saw a miracle of criminal innovation. He decided he could build something better. In September 2014, he began work on what would become AlphaBay. By November 2014, a preliminary version was available to invited users. On December 22, 2014, just over 14 months after the FBI shut down Silk Road, AlphaBay officially launched. The announcement was made by Alpha 02 himself, posting on dark web forums with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. The new marketplace, he wrote, was designed to become the largest eBay-style underworld marketplace. He intended nothing less than to build the Amazon of the criminal internet. Part 3. Building an Empire, the Rise of AlphaBay. In its first 90 days of operation, AlphaBay attracted 14,000 new users. This was a strong start by the standards of the dark web marketplace world, but nothing that would have alarmed law enforcement or captured international headlines. It was, at that point, one of several dozen dark web marketplaces competing for the business of criminals, drug buyers, and fraudsters around the world. What distinguished AlphaBay from its competitors was the quality of its engineering. The marketplace was, by the consensus of those who studied it, significantly more sophisticated than anything that had preceded it. It offered features that legitimate e-commerce platforms would have recognized: a robust dispute resolution system, escrow services for transactions, a vendor rating system based on user feedback, two-factor authentication for account security, and, crucially, support for multiple cryptocurrencies, including Monero, which offered stronger anonymization than Bitcoin. The architect approached the construction of Alphabay with the same methodical professionalism that he brought to legitimate software development. He hired moderators. He developed customer service protocols. He wrote and enforced community rules. He invested in server infrastructure spread across multiple jurisdictions, including Lithuania, where the primary hosting was located. He ran Alphabay not like a criminal enterprise, but like a startup that happened to be facilitating the global trade in drugs, weapons, stolen financial data, and hacking tools. By October 2015, less than a year after its launch, Alphabay had been recognized by researchers at the Digital Citizens Alliance as the largest dark web marketplace in the world. It had surpassed Agora, which had been the dominant marketplace, until it voluntarily shut down in August 2015 due to concerns about security vulnerabilities. Alphabay absorbed a significant portion of Agora's displaced user base, growing rapidly in the vacuum left by its competitors' departure. The growth that followed was extraordinary. By mid-2016, Alphabay was processing transactions worth hundreds of thousands of dollars every single day. By the time of its shutdown in July 2017, the platform had more than 400,000 registered users, more than 40,000 vendors, and an estimated 369,000 active listings. It was conducting between $600,000 and $800,000 in transactions every day. Law enforcement analysts who examined its records after its seizure estimated that the total volume of transactions processed through Alphabay over its lifetime exceeded $1 billion, making it, by a factor of approximately 10, larger than Silk Road had been at the time of its takedown. The scale of what was being sold on Alphabay is difficult to fully comprehend. There were more than 250,000 listings for illegal drugs and toxic chemicals. Heroin, fentanyl, methamphetamine, cocaine, MDMA, LSD, and dozens of other controlled substances, listed and rated with the same care that a legitimate retailer might devote to descriptions of electronics or household goods. There were more than 100,000 listings in other categories: stolen and fraudulent identity documents, counterfeit currency, malware and hacking tools, firearms, and fraudulent financial services. This last category, the hacking tools, the malware, the cyber attack services, is central to understanding why Alphabay represented something qualitatively different from Silk Road. Silk Road had been primarily a drug marketplace. It had its categories for hacking services, but they were a relatively minor part of the overall business. Alphabay, by contrast, became a central node in the global cybercrime ecosystem. Ransomware builders, keyloggers, remote access Trojans, phishing kits, zero-day exploits, DDoS for hire services. All of these were available for purchase on Alphabay with the same ease and reliability as purchasing controlled substances. The implications of this were profound. Alphabay was not merely enabling drug addiction. It was providing the infrastructure for a new generation of cybercrime at a scale and accessibility that had never existed before. A moderately skilled criminal who wanted to deploy ransomware against corporate targets no longer needed to develop the tools themselves. They could buy ready-made packages from professional criminal developers on Alphabay, complete with customer support and update services. The democratization of cybercrime, which had been happening gradually for years, was accelerated dramatically by Alphabay's existence. Meanwhile, the architect was growing wealthy beyond anything he could have imagined in his computer repair shop in Quebec. Alphabet's business model was straightforward. The marketplace took a commission on every transaction, typically ranging from 2 to 4%. On a platform processing hundreds of millions of dollars in annual transactions, this generated extraordinary revenues. The architect accumulated assets in cryptocurrency worth tens of millions of dollars. He purchased luxury vehicles. He acquired real estate. He obtained passports from multiple countries. He relocated to Bangkok, Thailand, where he lived with his wife in a comfortable residence in a quiet suburb, maintaining the outward appearance of a legitimate technology entrepreneur. He posted videos of himself driving expensive cars. He boasted online about his financial success. He lived, in short, as if he had already won, as if the anonymity of the dark web were an impenetrable shield that could protect him from any consequence for as long as he chose to maintain it. He was wrong. For Part 4, the investigation, how they found him. The investigation that would eventually bring down Alphabet began, as so many great investigations do, with a seemingly trivial piece of evidence. The FBI's Sacramento division, which had been assigned to investigate dark web marketplaces, began scrutinizing Alphabet in earnest in the period following Silk Road's takedown. They were looking for patterns, for weaknesses, for the kind of operational security failures that had brought down the dread Pirate Roberts. What they found, buried in the metadata of Alphabet's early operations, was a Hotmail address. When Alphabet first launched in December 2014, the system generated emails that were sent to new users, welcome emails, password reset notifications, contained a "from" address field. That address was a personal Hotmail account registered in the real name of the architect. The same address appeared in his LinkedIn profile. It was connected to his legitimate computer repair business in Canada. It was, in other words, a direct bridge between the anonymous persona of Alpha02, the dark web kingpin, and the real person sitting behind a laptop in Bangkok. This was the original sin of Alphabet's operational security. It was a mistake that might have been made during the rush and excitement of launching a new business. The kind of slip that happens when a person is doing everything themselves, when they are simultaneously writing code, setting up servers, writing forum posts, and configuring email systems, and when the separation between their legitimate identity and their criminal persona is not yet as absolute as it needs to be. Whatever the reason, the email address had been there since the beginning, sitting in Alphabet's system logs, waiting for an investigator with the patience and skill to find it. But finding an email address is not the same as making an arrest. The architect was in Thailand, a country with which the United States had an extradition treaty, but which also presented significant logistical challenges. The evidence chain needed to be constructed carefully through proper legal channels in a way that would survive the scrutiny of courts in multiple jurisdictions. Law enforcement needed not just to know who the architect was, they needed to prove it in a way that would hold up in court. The investigation that followed was a masterclass in multi-jurisdictional law enforcement coordination. The FBI worked with the Drug Enforcement Administration, with Europol, with the Dutch National Police, with Canadian authorities, with Lithuanian law enforcement, with French investigators, and ultimately with the Royal Thai Police. Intelligence was shared. Warrants were obtained in sequence through the appropriate legal channels of each participating country, and a picture was assembled, piece by piece, through months of painstaking work, of the architect's true identity and location. Crucially, investigators used a combination of traditional investigative techniques and sophisticated digital analysis to build their case. They traced Bitcoin transactions, Hachi using blockchain analysis tools to follow the flow of funds from Alphabet's cryptocurrency wallets through a series of conversion steps and ultimately to accounts connected to the architect's real-world identity. They examined the historical pseudonymous postings of Alpha 02, including a post from 2008 on a French technology forum in which the same username had appeared alongside both the Hotmail address and the architect's real name. They found the servers. Working with law enforcement in Lithuania, investigators located the primary servers on which Alphabet operated, hosted at a company with connections that could be traced through a sequence of corporate records back to the architect himself. The servers were not seized immediately. Doing so would have tipped off their target and potentially triggered the kind of emergency shutdown and evidence destruction that had almost hampered earlier investigations. Instead, investigators monitored the servers, building their case until the time was right. By early May 2017, law enforcement was verifiably active on Alphabet, monitoring transactions, collecting data, building the evidentiary record that would be needed for prosecution. On June 1, 2017, a warrant was issued by the United States District Court for the Eastern District of California, charging the architect with racketeering, narcotics trafficking, identity theft and access device fraud, transfer of false identification documents, trafficking in illegal device-making equipment, and conspiracy. The case had been built, so now came the arrest. Part 5. Operation Bayonet, the takedown. The operation that would bring down Alphabet and, in a remarkable double maneuver, simultaneously destroy its most likely successor, was codenamed Operation Bayonet. The name was deliberately chosen as a triple pun: Bay for the digital bays of the internet, net for the network itself, and bayonet for the act of cornering a dangerous adversary. FBI investigators would later say they had been pleased to find that no one had already used the name. The operational challenge facing law enforcement in July 2017 was considerable. The architect needed to be arrested in Thailand in a way that prevented him from destroying evidence, specifically from closing his laptop. In the world of encrypted digital crime, a locked or powered-off computer is a fortress. Encryption keys stored only in memory are lost when a device is shut down, and without those keys, even seized evidence may be unreadable. The FBI needed the architect arrested while he was actively logged in to Alphabet as its administrator. On July 5, 2017, Thai police executed what appeared to be a simple traffic incident near the architect's home in Bangkok. A vehicle made a miscalculated turn and collided with the front gate of his residence. When the architect came to the door to investigate, curious, perhaps annoyed, certainly not alarmed by what appeared to be an ordinary fender bender, Thai agents moved in and arrested him. He was still logged in to Alphabet's administrative panel. His laptop was open. The encryption keys were in memory. The agents had achieved exactly what they needed. What they found on that laptop was extraordinary. It was not encrypted. It contained not only administrative access to Alphabet, but also an unencrypted personal net worth statement, a document mapping the architect's total financial holdings across multiple jurisdictions, including accounts in Liechtenstein, Cyprus, Switzerland, and Antigua, as well as assets held jointly with his wife in Thailand. The laptop contained communications with Alphabet's data centers, private messages with users and vendors, and passwords to servers and infrastructure around the world. Law enforcement had been handed, in a single moment, the keys to an entire criminal empire. The servers were seized simultaneously in multiple countries. Alphabet went dark. Its 400,000 users found themselves locked out of the platform unable to access their accounts or withdraw funds held in escrow. In the chaotic days that followed, rumors spread across dark web forums about what had happened. Had there been a technical failure? Had the architect performed an exit scam, stealing users' funds and disappearing? The true answer, that law enforcement had quietly and completely dismantled the operation, was not immediately apparent. This deliberate ambiguity was not accidental. It was, in fact, the key to the second phase of Operation Bayonet, a phase that would prove even more audacious than the first. Even as Alpha Bay was being shut down, law enforcement had already been running a second operation targeting Hansa, the dark web's third-largest marketplace. On June 20th, 2017, 2 weeks before the Alpha Bay takedown, German police had arrested Hansa's 2 administrators, who were German citizens. Dutch police had then taken complete control of the Hansa site and were secretly impersonating its administrators, running the marketplace as a law enforcement honeypot. The timing was exquisite. Law enforcement knew that when Alpha Bay went dark, its displaced users would immediately flock to the next most prominent marketplace. That marketplace was Hansa, and Hansa was already under police control. Over the weeks that followed Alpha Bay's shutdown, Hansa's traffic increased by approximately 8-fold as refugees from the collapsed marketplace flooded in. Every transaction they conducted, every message they sent, every vendor who re-uploaded photographs of their products, all of it was being recorded by Dutch police, who had modified Hansa's code in subtle but devastating ways. Passwords were recorded in plain text. A supposedly helpful automatic PGP encryption feature had been modified to record copies of users' decrypted messages before encoding them. Photo metadata, which can reveal the geographic location where an image was taken, was captured before the site's usual metadata stripping tool could remove it. The result was an intelligence windfall of historic proportions. By the time Hansa was finally shut down on July 20th, 2017, the same day that U.S. Attorney General Jeff Sessions publicly announced the Alpha Bay takedown, Dutch police and their international partners had collected detailed information on thousands of vendors and buyers, soon leading to investigations across the globe. The announcement of the Alpha Bay shutdown was made at a press conference in Washington, attended by FBI Acting Director Andrew McCabe, alongside the Attorney General and the Deputy Attorney General. It was, said McCabe, a landmark operation. We're talking about multiple servers in different countries, hundreds of millions in cryptocurrency, and a darknet drug trade that spanned the globe. Conservative estimates suggested that several hundred separate investigations across multiple countries were being conducted simultaneously as a direct result of Alpha Bay's activities. Investigations into drug distribution networks, into cybercriminals who had purchased and deployed hacking tools, into vendors who had supplied fentanyl that caused overdose deaths in the United States. From the scale of the downstream harm that Alpha Bay had enabled was staggering. Part 6. Death in Custody, the Unresolved Ending. 8 days after his arrest, on July 12, 2017, the architect was found dead in his cell at the Thai Narcotics Suppression Bureau. He was 25 years old. Thai authorities ruled the death a suicide by hanging. He had used a towel. He was never tried. He never gave a full account of his actions. He never answered questions about the scope of what he had built, about the harm it had caused, about the choices he had made over the previous decade. The investigation, so meticulously constructed over years of work, culminating in one of the most sophisticated law enforcement operations in the history of cybercrime, ended in a jail cell before it could reach a courtroom. The circumstances of his death have never been fully explained. Thai authorities conducted an investigation and reached a conclusion of suicide. Law enforcement agencies involved in Operation Bayonet accepted this finding. But the questions have not entirely gone away. The architect had, by all accounts, been cooperative to some degree following his arrest, perhaps understanding the weight of the evidence against him. Whether his cooperation extended to providing information about other criminal actors is not publicly known. What is known is that his death left a legal and evidentiary vacuum. The asset seizures that followed, luxury vehicles, real estate, cryptocurrency wallets containing many millions of dollars, accounts in multiple countries, proceeded through civil forfeiture proceedings rather than criminal prosecution. His wife was separately charged with money laundering. The servers were seized. The data was analyzed. But the man at the center of it all never faced a jury. At the FBI's press conference announcing the shutdown, investigators showed surveillance footage of the arrest to journalists at a cybersecurity conference. An FBI special agent narrated the video with what some observers described as uncomfortable lightheartedness, inviting the audience to see if you can spot the moment when he realizes he's about to be arrested. Critics noted, with some justification, that celebrating the arrest of a man who died in custody 8 days later, a man who had never been convicted of anything, raised uncomfortable questions about the boundaries of appropriate conduct. The architect's father later spoke publicly about his son, describing a young man of extraordinary intelligence who had made catastrophic choices. His father said he believed his son had been aware that his luck was running out, that the pressure of running an empire of that scale, with that many adversaries and that much law enforcement scrutiny, had been crushing him long before the arrest. Whether the architect experienced guilt about what he had built is unknown. Whether he felt pride or fear or exhaustion, or all of these things together, whether in those final days in a Bangkok jail cell, he reflected on the millions of dollars in drug transactions facilitated by his platform, on the overdose deaths that had been linked to substances sold through Alphabay, on the ransomware attacks enabled by the hacking tools his marketplace had sold. None of this is recorded. He took whatever answers he had to those questions with him. Part 7. The consequences, measuring the damage. The full impact of Alphabay's 3-year existence is extraordinarily difficult to quantify. Law enforcement agencies and academic researchers have attempted to trace the downstream effects of the marketplace's activity. But the hidden and encrypted nature of the dark web makes comprehensive accounting impossible. What we can say, with confidence drawn from documented evidence, is that the harm was substantial, multidimensional, and lasting. In the immediate term, the FBI linked sales of heroin and fentanyl originating from Alphabay vendors to multiple overdose deaths in the United States. Fentanyl, a synthetic opioid approximately 50 to 100 times more potent than morphine, was available on Alphabay in quantities and at prices that made it accessible to dealers across the country. The explosion of fentanyl overdose deaths that characterized the opioid crisis of the mid-2000s cannot be attributed solely to Alphabay, but investigators found direct connections between specific Alphabay vendors and specific overdose deaths. The cybercrime dimensions of the harm were equally significant, if less viscerally immediate. The malware and hacking tools sold on Alphabay were subsequently deployed in attacks against businesses, governments, and individuals around the world. Ransomware packages purchased through Alphabay have been traced to attacks on hospitals, schools, and municipal governments. Identity documents sold through the marketplace were used in fraudulent financial transactions and immigration fraud. The stolen credit card data traded on the platform contributed to financial losses for individuals and institutions across dozens of countries. The total financial volume of Alphabet's operations, exceeding $1 billion over approximately 2.5 years, provides a rough sense of the scale of economic harm, though it substantially understates the actual damage. The downstream effects of drug trafficking, cybercrime, and financial fraud facilitated by the marketplace ripple through communities and institutions in ways that cannot be reduced to transaction totals. The investigations that followed the shutdown were extensive. Law enforcement across multiple countries, the United States, Canada, the Netherlands, Germany, France, the United Kingdom, Australia, and others, pursued cases against vendors and buyers identified through Alphabet's servers and through the Hansa honeypot operation. Hundreds of arrests were made. Significant quantities of drugs, firearms, and criminal proceeds were seized. The disruption to drug distribution networks, in particular, was substantial. Though criminal markets are resilient, and the void left by Alphabet was eventually filled by successor platforms. For the investigators who worked the case, the seizure of Alphabet was both a triumph and a reminder of the inherent limits of law enforcement action against the dark web. The message to criminals is, "Don't think that you are safe because you're on the dark web," said FBI Special Agent Chris Thomas, who worked on the investigation. They understood that law enforcement was monitoring their activity, but they felt so protected by the dark web technology that they thought they could get away with their crimes. What Thomas and his colleagues understood, what Operation Bayonet had demonstrated, was that no technical architecture, however sophisticated, could fully compensate for human error. The architect had been extraordinarily skilled. His creation had been genuinely impressive by the cold assessment of technical achievement, separated from its criminal purpose. But he had made mistakes. Small ones at first. An email address used in the wrong context. A server hosted at a company with traceable connections. And then, in the days of his greatest success, larger ones. The visible wealth. The boastful online presence, the unencrypted laptop left open at the moment of arrest. Every empire, however built, rests ultimately on the reliability of the people who built it. And people, in the end, make mistakes. Part 8. The Phoenix. Alphabet returns. The story of Alphabet did not end with Operation Bayonet. In August 2021, 4 years after the takedown, the dark web was shaken by an announcement on a forum called Dread, one of the primary gathering places for the dark web community. A user claiming to be D-Snake, who had been Alphabet's security administrator and co-founder, announced the marketplace's return. Skepticism was immediate and intense. Claims of resurrection are common in the dark web world, where the names of shut-down marketplaces are frequently appropriated by scammers seeking to exploit the brand recognition of established criminal operations. But D-Snake was prepared for this skepticism. To prove his identity, he signed his announcement using the original PGP cryptographic key associated with his handle from 2014 to 2017, a key that had not been compromised during Operation Bayonet and whose private component remained in his exclusive possession. The proof was convincing. Alphabet was indeed back, run by its surviving co-founder, under an operational security framework that had learned from the catastrophic failures of the original. Bitcoin was banned as a payment method. Only Monero, with its stronger anonymization properties, was accepted. The new platform implemented strict rules designed to prevent the kinds of identity leakage that had doomed its predecessor. Snake announced that the platform would not store unnecessary user data, would implement improved server infrastructure, and would operate with a much greater emphasis on anonymization at every level. Alphabay 2.0, as it became known, attracted significant traffic from the dark web community. Its second incarnation lasted until early 2023, when the platform abruptly went offline, apparently as a result of Snake allegedly making off with user funds in a classic exit scam. The same kind of betrayal of trust that had plagued the dark web marketplace world since its earliest days. Snake's own departure from his relaunch was marked by a collapse that observers described as deeply symbolic. The architect of the second Alphabay, who had promised to do better than his predecessor, ultimately proved no more trustworthy. The complete arc of Alphabay, from its confident December 2014 launch, through 3 years of explosive growth, through the dramatic double takedown of Operation Bayonet, through the 4-year gap, through the promised Phoenix resurrection, through the second collapse, illustrates something profound about the nature of criminal markets in the digital age.
When you need to
These
strike
markets
unseen,
are resilient.
Our network is your
They are
hammer.
adaptive.
Total denial.
They learn
Guaranteed.
from their predecessors' failures, implement technical improvements, develop more sophisticated operational security protocols, and yet they are also consistently self-defeating. And the centralized trust model on which they rely, the platform operator as the guarantor of transactions, holding funds in escrow, resolving disputes, maintaining reputation, creates precisely the vulnerability that destroys them. Either law enforcement finds the operator, as they found the architect, or the operator finds the temptation of absconding with user funds irresistible. In either case, the users are betrayed and the platform collapses. Part 9. The wider context, dark web crime in historical perspective. The story of Alphabay cannot be understood in isolation. It is part of a much larger history of the evolution of criminal commerce in the digital age. A history that stretches back to the early carding forums of the late 1990s and forward to the fragmented, decentralized criminal marketplace landscape of the present day. In the years before Silk Road, the dark web's criminal economy was primarily organized around forums, closed communities where individuals with specialized knowledge could trade information, services, and, to a limited extent, physical goods. The Shadow Crew Forum, which operated in the early 2000s, is generally considered the first major English-language criminal forum, and its model, member-based, invitation-only, with reputation systems based on verified criminal activity, established patterns that persist in the underground to this day. Shadow Crew was taken down by law enforcement in October 2004, but its basic architecture was immediately replicated by successor communities. The period between Shadow Crew's shutdown and Silk Road's launch saw the gradual professionalization of the dark web criminal economy. The forums became more technically sophisticated. Escrow services emerged to reduce the trust deficit inherent in anonymous criminal transactions. Cryptocurrency, initially Bitcoin and later a proliferation of alternative coins, replaced the payment methods, Western Union transfers, prepaid debit cards, Liberty Reserve funds, that had previously served as the financial infrastructure of underground commerce. Each payment method that was used and then traced by law enforcement was replaced by one that was harder to trace. The Silk Road era represented the first synthesis of all these elements into a truly coherent marketplace model. What the Silk Road's founder understood, and what his successors, including the architect, built upon, was that the marketplace model required trust infrastructure that was independent of any individual vendor or buyer. A forum allows trust to develop through accumulated reputation over time. A marketplace accelerates this by providing escrow, dispute resolution, and reputation mechanisms that make individual transactions reliable even between strangers with no prior relationship. The genius of Silk Road was in seeing that the same mechanisms that made eBay trustworthy, the rating systems, the dispute resolution, the escrow, could be adapted to an anonymous, encrypted, cryptocurrency-denominated criminal market. Alphabay was a refinement of this model, not a departure from it, but a refinement so significant in scale and sophistication that it represented a qualitative change in the nature of the criminal marketplace. The shift from Silk Road to Alphabay was in some ways analogous to the shift from a local farmers market to a regional wholesale distribution network. The architect didn't change the fundamental model. He industrialized it. The cybercrime dimension of Alphabay's operations is particularly significant in historical context. Before dedicated marketplace infrastructure existed for criminal hacking tools, the barrier to entry for cybercrime was relatively high. To conduct a sophisticated cyber attack, a criminal needed either advanced technical skills or access to specialized underground communities where tools could be obtained. Alphabay, by making criminal software commercially available with the convenience and reliability of a legitimate e-commerce platform, dramatically lowered this barrier. The effects were felt across the cybersecurity landscape in the years following Alphabay's peak. Ransomware attacks escalated dramatically. Credential stuffing attacks, automated attempts to access accounts using username-password combinations stolen in previous data breaches, became routine. The commercial availability of exploit kits and remote access Trojans contributed to a general escalation in the volume and sophistication of cybercrime that challenged organizations of all sizes. Law enforcement's response to Alphabay and to the dark web marketplace ecosystem more broadly was not merely tactical, it was also methodological. Operation Bayonet demonstrated, for the first time at this scale, that coordinated international law enforcement could successfully dismantle a major dark web marketplace. It showed that the combination of blockchain analysis, traditional investigative techniques, and technical exploitation of operational security failures could overcome even sophisticated attempts at anonymization. It validated the investment in international law enforcement cooperation, the years of relationship building, the sharing of intelligence, the development of legal frameworks for cross-border data access that had gone into building the capacity to conduct operations of this kind. The lessons of Alphabay have been incorporated into both law enforcement practice and criminal practice. Law enforcement agencies around the world have developed specialized dark web investigation units. Blockchain analysis has become a professional discipline, with dedicated companies providing forensic services to government and private sector clients. The FBI, Europol, and their partner agencies continue to conduct periodic large-scale operations against dark web marketplaces, with notable successes including the takedown of Dark Market in January 2021, an operation that shut down what Europol described at the time as the world's largest illegal marketplace. With approximately 500,000 users and over 320,000 transactions, and numerous other operations in the years since. On the criminal side, the lessons of Alphabay have pushed the dark web marketplace world toward decentralization. The vulnerability that destroyed Alphabay, the single point of failure represented by a central operator who could be identified, arrested, or corrupted, has led to the development of decentralized marketplace protocols that attempt to distribute trust and eliminate the need for a trusted central party. How effective these approaches will ultimately be remains to be seen. The history of criminal innovation and law enforcement response suggests that neither side achieves permanent advantage. Part 10. What remains? The meaning of the architect's story. The story of the architect and Alphabet is, among other things, a story about the relationship between technical brilliance and ethical judgment. The architect was, by any fair assessment, an extraordinary technical talent. The platform he built, its architecture, its feature set, its reliability and scalability, represented genuine engineering achievement. In another life, the skills he deployed in building Alphabet might have built a legitimate technology company worth hundreds of millions of dollars. That they were deployed instead in building a marketplace that facilitated the global distribution of fentanyl, heroin, and ransomware, that contributed to overdose deaths, to cyber attacks on hospitals, to the theft of financial data from millions of ordinary people, is not a failure of technical skill. It is a failure of something else, of the moral imagination that asks not only, can I build this, but should I? The architect's story is also a story about the seductive power of the underground.
What are you doing?
The carding forums he frequented as a teenager, the sense of belonging and capability they provided to the community of technically sophisticated people operating outside the boundaries of conventional society. These were real attractions. The dark web underground has always been, in part, a subculture that valorizes technical skill, celebrates defiance of authority, and offers a kind of belonging to people who feel alienated from mainstream society. For many participants, the criminal dimensions of that subculture are incidental to the sense of community and capability it provides. But the architect was not a teenager posting on forums for the intellectual stimulation. He was an adult who made a considered decision to build, manage, and profit from an infrastructure of harm. The drugs that killed people, the malware that crippled institutions, the stolen identities that ruined financial lives, all of it passed through the marketplace he had constructed and maintained. He knew what was being sold. He wrote and enforced the rules of his marketplace. He was, in the most precise legal and moral sense, responsible. The question of what the architect understood about the consequences of his work, whether he thought about the overdose deaths, whether he cared, is one that can never now be answered. His death in custody precluded not only a trial, but also the kind of extended public reckoning that has accompanied other major cybercrime cases. We do not have his testimony. We do not have his explanation of his own motivations. We have only the platform he built, the evidence that was found on his laptop, and the silence of a jail cell in Bangkok. City, what the architect's story does give us, with unmistakable clarity, is a lesson about the limits of technical solutions to social problems. The dark web was built on the premise that technology, specifically the technology of anonymization and encryption, could create a space beyond the reach of law and social consequence. This premise was never entirely sound. Operational security, however rigorous, depends ultimately on human beings maintaining perfect discipline across every interaction, every communication, every transaction. And human beings, under sustained pressure, over years of maintaining multiple identities and managing complex criminal enterprises, make mistakes. The Hotmail address was not an extraordinary mistake. It was an ordinary one. A small lapse, perhaps made in haste during the early days of a project, a moment when the boundary between legitimate and criminal identity was not maintained with sufficient care. But in the architecture of law enforcement investigation, that single data point an email address connected to a name, was enough to begin the unwinding of everything. This is perhaps the most enduring lesson of AlphaBay, that in a world of total surveillance, perfect anonymity is not a technical problem to be solved, but a human impossibility to be managed indefinitely. And indefinitely, in the life of a criminal empire, never lasts long enough. Epilogue. The dark web after AlphaBay. The dark web marketplace landscape today looks significantly different from the world that AlphaBay dominated in 2016 and 2017. The dramatic double takedown of Operation Bayonet, followed by the catastrophic exit scams and law enforcement operations that characterized the years immediately after, produced a crisis of trust that reshaped the entire ecosystem. The immediate aftermath of AlphaBay's closure saw a proliferation of smaller, shorter-lived marketplaces competing to fill the vacuum. Dream Market, which had been operating quietly in AlphaBay's shadow, became temporarily dominant before shutting down voluntarily in April 2019 amid persistent DDoS attacks and rumors of law enforcement infiltration. Wall Street Market, one of Dream Market's successors, performed an exit scam in May 2019, stealing approximately $11 million in user funds before law enforcement arrested its operators. Trade Route, Berlusconi Market, Empire Market. Each rose and fell in rapid succession, and each exit scam or law enforcement takedown further eroding user trust in the centralized marketplace model. Empire Market, which had explicitly modeled itself as an AlphaBay clone and attracted over 1.68 million unique registered users at its peak, suddenly went offline in August 2020, with its operators allegedly absconding with approximately $30 million in user funds. Its co-founders were later charged and ultimately pleaded guilty in federal court to drug conspiracy charges, with the prosecutors revealing that the marketplace had facilitated over $430 million in illegal transactions across more than 4 million separate transactions. By the early 2020s, the landscape had evolved in ways that reflected the lessons of the AlphaBay era. Law enforcement operations continued to score significant victories. Dark Market, seized in January 2021. Hydra, the massive Russian-language marketplace, shut down in April 2022. Breach Forums, the successor to Raid Forums for trading stolen data, seized in March 2023. Each operation built on the methodologies developed and refined through the AlphaBay investigation and its successors. At the same time, the criminal marketplace world adapted. Decentralized protocols that eliminated the need for trusted central operators began attracting serious development effort. Monero became the dominant cryptocurrency for criminal transactions, offering stronger anonymization than Bitcoin. Operations became more distributed, more redundant, and more resistant to single points of failure. So the cat-and-mouse dynamic that has characterized the relationship between law enforcement and criminal innovation since the earliest days of the internet continued to evolve, with neither side achieving permanent dominance. What has not changed, what the story of AlphaBay illustrates with particular clarity, is the fundamental human cost of the dark web criminal economy. The drugs distributed through these platforms kill people. The hacking tools they sell enable attacks on hospitals, schools, and critical infrastructure. The stolen data they trade destroys financial lives and enables identity fraud that takes years to untangle. The criminal markets of the dark web are not an abstract technical phenomenon. They are a mechanism for causing harm to real people at real scale, and the brilliance of their architects does not make them anything other than what they are. The architect built the largest hacking empire the dark web had ever seen. He was 25 years old when he died. The empire is gone, but the blueprint remains, studied carefully by those who seek to build the next one, and by those who seek to stop them. The investigation never ends.